Imagine you are a mid-level analyst, it's 2008, and you're sitting in this sleek, glass-walled JP Morgan conference room.
Oh man, the peak of the financial crisis. High stakes.
High stakes, totally. So the CFO just finished speaking, and the room goes completely uncomfortably quiet. Then the CEO turns directly to you and asks, "You've been working on the European integration. What's your view on the timeline risks?"
Oh, wow.
Right. You have exactly 0 seconds to prepare. 12 senior executives are staring at you,
I
waiting.
mean, that is the absolute definition of a professional ambush. Your face flushes, your heart rate spikes, and your mind just goes entirely blank.
Exactly. You try to speak, but you end up just, rambling for 45 excruciating seconds until they politely nod and move on. It's a terrifying scenario.
It really is.
And it actually comes straight from the experiences of Mary Beth Hazeldean, who is a communication expert whose research we are unpacking today. But what if you could rewire your brain to actually thrive in that exact moment?
That's the dream, right?
Yeah. That's the mission for today. We are doing a deep dive into the mechanics of spontaneous brilliance. We are digging through a whole stack of sources: FBI negotiation tactics, Stanford communication lectures, linguistic theory, behavioral psychology, all to understand how to master the art of impromptu speaking.
Because confident impromptu speaking isn't, some genetic gift you are either born with or you aren't. It is an architecture.
Yes, an architecture. For anyone listening, it's about structure, managing cognitive load, and manipulating emotional cues.
And it's a system anyone can learn, provided we first understand the malfunction. I mean, to fix that dreaded boardroom freeze, we have to look under the hood at what is physically breaking down in the brain when we're put on the spot.
So what actually happens in our biology during that silent, terrifying moment after the CEO asks the question? Like, why do incredibly smart people suddenly lose the ability to string a coherent sentence together?
Well, it comes down to a catastrophic cognitive overload. When you're ambushed with a question, your brain is suddenly forced to execute two massive, incredibly complex tasks simultaneously.
Okay, what are they?
First, it has to figure out what to say. It is frantically searching your memory banks, retrieving facts, analyzing data. And second, it is trying to figure out how to organize those thoughts into a compelling, grammatically correct narrative.
Which means working memory just completely taps out.
It crashes. The human brain is a marvel, but working memory has strict bandwidth limits. Trying to simultaneously generate ideas and format them for an audience is, well, like trying to run too many heavy rendering programs on an old laptop.
The screen just freezes.
Exactly. But to really grasp why this overload happens specifically in professional settings, we have to pull in some fascinating linguistic theory from a researcher named Jim Cummins.
Okay.
He studies how we process language, and he categorizes our fluency into two distinct buckets, BICS and CALP.
Okay, let's break down that jargon a bit. What does that first bucket, BICS, look like in everyday life?
So linguists call the first bucket BICS, which stands for Basic Interpersonal Communicative Skills. This is basically your autopilot language.
Like chatting with a friend.
Yeah, it's the casual conversational fluency you use with your friends or your family. And the defining feature of this language is that it is cognitively undemanding and context embedded.
Context embedded, meaning the physical environment is doing a lot of the heavy lifting for you, right?
Precisely.
Like if you and I are sitting at a cafe discussing the roast of a coffee, I can use nonverbal cues. I can gesture. If I forget a word, I can literally just point to the mug in front of us.
Yeah, the context fills in the blanks.
Right.
Because the environment supports the conversation, your brain doesn't have to work very hard to maintain it. You could chat for hours without feeling mentally exhausted.
Which brings us to the second bucket.
Right, CALP.
Mm-hmm.
And CALP is a completely different neurological challenge. That stands for Cognitive Academic Language Proficiency.
Ah.
This is the language of the high-stakes presentation, the academic paper, the boardroom defense. It is highly complex, heavily abstract, and crucially, it is context-reduced.
So those environmental crutches we had at the cafe are just gone. You can't just point at a coffee cup to explain European integration timeline risks?
No, you absolutely cannot. You have to build the entire reality using only your words. Furthermore, this type of communication forces you to use highly specific linguistic structures.
Like what?
Well, you're often required to use a reported style, speaking objectively about distant events. You also have to rely on what linguists call Nominalizations.
Nominalizations. That sounds intense.
It's just a mechanism where you turn an active verb into a static noun to sound more formal or academic.
Oh, I think I know what you mean.
Yeah, so instead of saying, we will construct the new building next year, which is an active BICS level sentence, you say, the construction of the new building will take place next year.
Okay, yeah. You are taking an action and turning it into a concept.
Exactly. And doing that on the fly requires immense cognitive heavy lifting.
It sounds like the difference between driving your daily commute versus being thrown into a high-speed chase.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Yeah, like when I'm in my casual, context-embedded BICS mode, it's like driving my usual route to work on an automatic transmission. I can listen to a podcast, sip my coffee, and I barely even remember the drive.
Right, autopilot.
But being put on the spot in that JP Morgan boardroom, that abstract, formal environment, is like suddenly being dropped into a manual transmission car in a foreign city where you don't speak the language during an absolute downpour.
That analogy perfectly captures the panic.
Yeah.
The reason we freeze is that a professional ambush violently strips away all the safe, environmental cushions of everyday conversation and drops us instantly into that high-stakes, context-reduced mode.
You're just stalling out.
You are stalling the manual car because you are desperately trying to translate the foreign street signs, the what to say, while simultaneously figuring out how to operate how to say it.
Man.
Yeah.
So if I'm stalling out in that boardroom, what is the literal first sentence out of my mouth to stop the crash? Because if the problem is that my brain can't process the what and the how at the same time, the solution has to involve eliminating one of those tasks, right?
Yes. We remove the how. And we do that by relying on frameworks. Matt Abrahams, a lecturer at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, teaches a mantra for this exact situation. Spontaneity thrives with structure.
Spontaneity thrives with structure. I like that.
A framework acts as a pre-installed, highly rigid container in your mind. Because the shape of the container is already built, you no longer have to spend any cognitive energy figuring out how to organize your thoughts.
You just pour your content, straight into it.
Exactly.
So let's give the listener some tangible tools here. What does one of these pre-installed containers actually look like when you are under fire?
The most versatile framework, which Mary Beth Hazeldine heavily advocates for, is an acronym known as P.R.E.P. It stands for Point, Reason, Example, Point.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. If the CEO asks my opinion on timeline risks, how does POP save me?
Okay, so you start with your point. You deliver your central thesis in one clear, declarative sentence. I believe the integration will be delayed by Q3.
Okay, boom. Point made.
Then you provide the reason. You explain the underlying logic behind your stance. Because the back-end data migration is significantly more complex than anticipated.
Makes sense.
Next, you anchor it with one concrete example. Last week, the beta test revealed a 40% error rate in data transfer. And finally, you bring it full circle and restate your original point. Therefore, we need to adjust our timeline expectations for Q3.
You know, what fascinates me about that structure is how it caters to the psychology of the audience, not just the speaker.
How do you mean?
Well, when people panic, their instinct is to start rambling about the backstory, the data, all the little nuances, hoping they eventually stumble onto a thesis. But the human brain hates suspense in a professional setting.
Oh, absolutely.
If you don't give the bottom line first, the listener is spending all their cognitive energy trying to guess your point, which means they aren't actually listening to your evidence.
Yes, leading with the conclusion drastically reduces the cognitive load for everyone in the room. But, professional ambushes aren't always about defending data. Sometimes the pressure comes in highly emotional settings. Imagine being unexpectedly asked to give a toast at a retirement dinner or trying to motivate a burned-out team on a Friday afternoon.
Yeah, P.R.E.P would feel way too clinical there. Like, if I stand up at a wedding and say, my point is that John is a good guy, my reason is he helped me move. For example, he carried my couch, therefore my point remains that he is a good guy. I'm gonna sound like a psychopath.
You really are. So how do we structure spontaneity for emotional resonance?
Yeah, what's the framework for that?
For those scenarios, communication expert Kathy Armillas suggests a framework widely used in Toastmasters called idea, emotion, outcome.
Idea, emotion, outcome.
Right. First, you identify a single core idea you want the audience to remember about the person or the project. Then, you inject emotion.
Meaning a story.
Exactly. You share a quick, vulnerable personal story that illustrates that idea. Finally, you pivot to the outcome, a clear action or a forward-looking wish. Here's to John's new chapter.
I have to admit, I do have some skepticism about this approach overall.
Really?
If we walk through life meticulously pouring our thoughts into P.R.E.P or idea emotion outcome algorithms, don't we risk losing our natural humanity? It sounds incredibly robotic to just speak in formulas all day.
Honestly, when you first start practicing these frameworks, it probably will feel a bit clunky and robotic to you. It takes repetition to make it fluid, but the goal isn't to become an automaton. It's to prevent self-sabotage.
Okay, that's fair.
And Matt Abrahams points out a crucial distinction here. People often confuse using a framework with memorizing a script.
And memorizing is dangerous because you can forget the lines.
It is a massive trap. If you try to memorize the perfect response, you create a rigid sequence where a single forgotten word derails the entire train of thought. Frameworks are not scripts, they are roadmaps.
Yeah, you know the destination, but you still choose the specific words in the moment.
Exactly. Abraham shares a brilliant piece of advice he got from his mother to explain this dynamic. She used to tell him, tell the time, don't build the clock.
Tell the time, don't build the clock.
Oh, that is a fantastic mental model. When you lack a framework, you drag your audience through the chaotic, messy process of building the clock in real time. You're showing them every gear and spring of your thought process.
Oh, it's a total mess.
Yeah. A framework simply allows you to glance at the mechanics internally and just give the audience the time. It provides clarity, and paradoxically, that clarity is what allows your natural personality to shine through without the clutter of anxiety.
Okay, that makes perfect sense for organizing the thoughts. But let's go back to the physics of the ambush itself. Even if I have the P.R.E.P container completely memorized and ready to go, the moment the CEO asks the question, I still need 3 or 4 seconds to actually gather the data and pour it into the container.
Right, you need a buffer.
Exactly. How do I buy that processing time without looking like a deer in headlights?
We have to tackle the anxiety beast. The first step to buying time is a major psychological reframe. Abrahams calls this concept maximizing mediocrity, or, more bluntly, daring to be dull.
Daring to be dull. For an ambitious professional sitting in a boardroom, that sounds like terrible career advice.
I know it sounds super counterintuitive, but it is the key to unlocking the freeze. The reason your brain locks up is that your internal standard is set to absolute perfection.
You want to sound like a genius.
Right. You are demanding impromptu brilliance on 0 seconds of notice. By intentionally lowering your internal bar from flawless to just good enough to answer the question, you release the immense pressure valve on your working memory.
Oh, it is the exact same psychology as writing a rough draft.
Yes, exactly.
Any writer will tell you that you cannot edit a blank page. If you sit at your keyboard and refuse to type a single word until you have formulated a Pulitzer-winning sentence, you will literally stare at a blinking cursor for hours.
And never write anything.
You have to give yourself permission to let the mediocre, clunky draft out of your mouth first, because only then can you refine it.
Spot on. And while you are giving yourself that permission, there are tactical, physical ways to stall for time. Communication experts suggest simply repeating the question back slowly.
Oh, I've seen people do that.
Yeah, it demonstrates active listening, validates the person asking, and most importantly, it buys you 3 golden seconds of processing time.
What about simply taking a breath? When you are panicking, a deep breath feels like a massive flashing sign that says, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I imagine it reads differently from the outside.
Totally differently. From an evolutionary psychology perspective, taking a deliberate, visible breath signals profound safety and competence to the audience. Think about it. A mammal being chased by a predator does not stop to take a slow, deep breath.
Oh, that's wild. So by breathing, you are subconsciously signaling to the room that you are not under threat. You look thoughtful, not terrified.
Exactly.
I've also heard of a Toastmasters tactic involving Rudyard Kipling's 6 honest serving men. Who, what, when, where, why, and how.
Yes, that is a brilliant background process to run. If you are totally blank, you quietly run those question words through your mind. Who is this impacting? Why does it matter? Answering just one of those internal prompts is usually enough to generate the point you need to start your framework.
But let's say the anxiety isn't just a mental block. Let's say it is fully physiological.
Like a full-on panic response.
Yeah, my heart is pounding, my palms are sweating, and my vision is tunneling. Can I biology my way out of that panic?
You actually can by forcing blood flow to different parts of your brain. Anxiety originates in the amygdala, the primitive emotional center. To shut down the panic response, you have to activate the prefrontal cortex, the logical, analytical center.
How do you do that on the spot?
Abraham suggests doing a highly complex, completely unrelated mental task right before you speak to force that shift,
Such a
counting backward from 100 by 13s or 17s.
by 13s. That's oddly specific.
It is, but it's a task so cognitively demanding that your brain literally has to pull resources away from the amygdala's panic cycle just to focus on the math.
Wow.
Another physiological hack involves temperature. Holding a cold glass of water or splashing cold water on your wrists stimulates the vagus nerve.
And the vagus nerve is the superhighway that controls the parasympathetic nervous system, right? The rest and digest function.
Exactly.
So by hitting it with cold temperature, you are forcing your heart rate to manually slow down, overriding the adrenaline spike.
You are basically hacking your own biology to calm down. So at this point, let's recap where we are. You have unfrozen the brain by daring to be dull.
Right.
You have bought time by breathing and hacking your vagus nerve. You have structured your thought into a crisp P.R.E.P framework. You are finally speaking.
But the words themselves aren't enough, are they?
No, they aren't.
If I deliver a perfectly structured P.R.E.P argument with a trembling voice, avoiding eye contact, and a defensive posture, the executives aren't going to buy it. How does the audience process our delivery, and how do we make them actually believe us?
This is where we transition from the internal structure of speaking to the external connection with the audience. We have to engineer charisma.
Charisma. Can you really engineer that?
Behavioral investigator Vanessa Van Edwards thinks so. In her book, Cues, she breaks down charisma not as some mystical aura, but as a very specific subconscious equation. Charisma equals warmth plus competence.
Meaning, every time someone looks at us, their brain is rapidly trying to answer two survival questions.
Right.
Can I trust you, which is warmth, and can I rely on you, which is competence?
Exactly. If you project high competence but low warmth, you are perceived as a threat, smart, but potentially dangerous or aloof.
And if you project high warmth but low competence,
You're perceived as sweet but ultimately useless. You have to hit both metrics simultaneously.
and Van Edwards' research shows how incredibly granular these cues can get, even down to visual processing. There is a fascinating detail in her work about typography.
Oh, the font study, yes.
If you are putting together a presentation slide and trying to be funny or approachable, you should never use the Arial font. Human brains subconsciously process the straight, rigid lines of Arial as highly competent but utterly lacking in warmth.
People literally do not find jokes funny if they're written in Arial.
That is insane. It demonstrates how deeply our brains are scanning for these signals. But, spontaneous speaking isn't always a friendly environment.
No, definitely not.
Sometimes projecting warmth and competence has to happen during a hostile disagreement. So, to maintain charisma under fire, we have to look at the strategies of Chris Voss, the former FBI lead hostage negotiator, and his framework of tactical empathy.
Applying FBI hostage negotiation tactics to a midweek status update is a bold leap, but it works.
How does that translate?
Well, Voss operates on the principle that under pressure, successful communication is rarely about aggressively arguing your logic. It is about making the other side feel so deeply, profoundly understood that their own defensive walls come down.
Right.
He uses a technique called mirroring to achieve this.
Okay, let's role play that. How does mirroring actually work in practice?
It is shockingly simple. You just repeat the last 3 to 5 words your counterpart said,
Yeah.
using an upward inquisitive vocal inflection, and then you stay completely silent.
So if an aggressive client leans over the table and says, "We simply cannot approve this rollout with the current budget constraints," I would just look at them and say, "The current budget constraints."
And then you wait.
Just silence.
Just silence. Psychologically, humans despise conversational silence, and they have an innate desire to explain themselves when prompted with curiosity. The client will instinctively start filling the silence, expanding on their underlying fears, giving you more information, and crucially, feeling like you are genuinely listening to them.
It builds instant warmth without sacrificing your competence.
Exactly. Voss also champions a maneuver called the Accusation Audit, which feels like a superpower for impromptu speaking.
The accusation audit. The concept there is to proactively list every negative, hostile assumption the other side might be harboring about you and say them out loud before the other person can.
Yes. By dragging their unspoken fears into the light, you disarm their amygdala. If you start a tense pitch by saying, "You probably think this new software is going to be incredibly expensive, completely disrupt your team's workflow for a month, and create more headaches than it solves," you have stolen their ammunition.
You are proving that you possess the competence to see their perspective and the warmth to care about it.
Right.
But let's assume the worst-case scenario. I've hacked my vagus nerve, I've used my P.R.E.P framework, I've run an accusation audit, and a senior VP still attacks my idea aggressively in front of the whole room.
It happens.
How do I maintain that delicate balance of warmth and competence when I'm being publicly dodgeballed?
Matt Abrahams calls this the dodgeball versus dialogue mindset. When our ideas are attacked, our evolutionary fight-or-flight response kicks in. We view the incoming questions as dodgeballs being hurled at our heads.
Naturally.
Our instinct is to shrink away and dodge them, or to catch them and hurl them back with twice the force.
Both of which instantly destroy any perception of warmth. You either look weak or you look hostile.
To survive, you have to reframe the attack, not as a dodgeball game, but as a collaborative dialogue. You do this by borrowing the fundamental rule of improv comedy, yes and.
Improv actors use yes and to accept whatever reality their scene partner just created and build upon it to keep the momentum going.
It works exactly the same in a boardroom conflict. If a VP attacks your timeline and you respond with, yes, I hear your concern, but our data shows, you have failed.
The word but.
The word but acts as a massive psychological eraser. It tells the other person that everything you said before the but was just polite throat clearing, and now you're going to tell them why they are wrong. It signals a fight.
So replacing it with and changes the dynamic. Yes, I see why the Q3 timeline feels rushed, and if we allocate 2 more engineers, we can mitigate that risk.
Look at.
You are validating their reality while introducing your own.
Your ultimate goal in these spontaneous clashes is not to bludgeon the other person with facts until they politely concede and say, you're right.
Because, as Voss points out, you're right is a dismissal. It is the phrase human beings use to get someone to stop talking and go away.
Yes. Your goal is to use tactical empathy to summarize their hostile stance so accurately and with such profound understanding that they look at you and involuntarily say, that's right. When you hear that's right, the dodgeball game is over. You have achieved genuine alignment, and your impromptu ideas will actually be considered.
Okay, so if we pull all of these threads together, mastering the professional ambush is a sequential process.
Let's hear it.
We recognize that our brains freeze due to the immense cognitive load of CALP environments. To survive, we remove the burden of figuring out how to organize our thoughts by relying on rigid structural frameworks like P.R.E.P.
We buy the vital seconds needed to load those frameworks by daring to be dull, using tactical breathing, and engaging our prefrontal cortex.
And finally, we deliver the message by projecting a precise mix of warmth and competence. We use mirroring to encourage dialogue, we audit accusations to disarm hostility, and we replace the combative but with a collaborative and to reach that coveted that's right moment.
That's the architecture.
But stepping back, looking at this entire architecture, are we just training ourselves to act like LLMs? Like ChatGPT?
It's wild to think about. Think about the mechanics of what we just described. We are applying highly specific structural algorithms, the P.R.E.P formula, calculated mirroring, pre-programmed empathy audits to generate an optimal conversational output.
We are literally running prompt engineering on ourselves.
What?
Which raises a wild question: what happens when 2 highly trained, ambitious executives enter a glass-walled room and unknowingly deploy these exact same psychological frameworks on each other? They are both running the algorithms, they are both mirroring, both auditing accusations, both structuring with P.R.E.P. Does that create the ultimate unbreakable human connection? Or does it result in an endless, perfectly polite conversational stalemate with 2 human algorithms stuck in an infinite loop of saying, that's right?
It is a fascinating implication. The tools that save us from the freeze might also be slowly standardizing how we interact. It's definitely something to deeply consider the next time you find yourself mirroring a colleague's cadence.
A slightly terrifying but brilliant thought to leave on. For now, though, the priority is making sure you don't stall out in the manual transmission car. Try putting these structural tools to work in low-stakes environments first. Practice the P.R.E.P method at the dinner table tonight when someone asks about your day.
Build the muscle memory now.
Exactly. So the next time a CEO turns to you in a dead, silent room, you won't panic and you won't try to build the clock. You'll just tell them the time. Thank you for joining us on this custom deep dive. We'll catch you next time.